Okay, so it's been a while since I made a boxing video, boxing related video, and this one seems as good as any. I've just watched the trailer for the documentary I Am Duran about the life and career of the great Panamanian fighter Roberto Duran. For anyone who was a boxing fan in the 70s and 80s, he needs no introduction. One of the greatest fighters to ever live. Little man, but hands of stone. Um, and I've seen the documentary at my local HMV. That's a good price. I'm thinking about getting it. Anyway, I've just seen an interview with him and Sugar Ray Leonard. I'm not sure who the interviewer is, but she was asking them about how their relationship has changed from being bitter rivals to being friends, and it's an interesting interview. And one of the questions she asked was about the fact that these two guys were part of an era known as the Four Kings. So that was an era in boxing, basically the 1980s. It's not an exact time frame, but roughly the 1980s, where you had four great fighters. The late marvelous Marvin Hagler, Tommy Hearns, Roberto Duran, and Sugar Ray Leonard. Those four guys. Sometimes Wilfred Benitez is added to that, the Five Kings. But generally, those four guys, they were all around at the same time, all fighting at the same time. I think they all fought each other, unless I'm mistaken. Um, and they really dominated the 80s. Because the early 80s, the heavyweight division was relatively, what had happened was Ali had retired. Um, there were a few great fights, but the 80s was really an era for the lighter divisions, I think. And here's the thing about boxing. Leonard, by the way, gave a very good answer. He said, "Of course, there's great talent out there." And I like that. I find that refreshing from Sugar Ray Leonard because too often in the world of boxing, we see people make these ridiculous sweeping statements about today's fighters. But the thing is, they could say that 10 years ago or now, and it's this transition thing. So, what I mean is, people today say, oh, the fighters today aren't what they once were. These guys can't hold a candle to the guys of the past. But then, 10 years from now, they'll say the fighters of 2021 were much better than the guys today, and so on. So, there's this way of disparaging and downplaying one's own generation. And I find that, well, I guess for older fighters, it's not their generation, but I'm talking about fans and pundits as well. It's something that I don't like because you can't generalize in that way. Every generation, every generation, since this sport became, kind of mainstream at the turn of the last century, every generation has had great fighters. Now, there has been some eras that have been better for certain divisions than others. I would argue, for example, the 2000s was not a great era for the heavyweights, partly because the Klitschko's were so dominant that it was a bit dull. And I'm a huge fan of the Klitschko's, but that was a phenomenon. I mean, when you think of the 2000s, difficult to really think of guys that really stand out apart from the Klitschko's. Lennox Lewis and Mike Tyson are retired in the first half of the decade, so I'm not counting them. I see them more as 90s heavyweights. Um, It's not to say there wasn't talent out there, but it's not a golden era compared to the 70s. Now, I believe the heavyweight division has entered a new golden era as of about 4 years ago, and it's dominated by Joshua, Fury, and Wilder. Um, those guys are all, particularly Fury and Joshua. Um, Wilder's a bit like Marmite. Some acknowledge his power, but he's a bit erratic and a bit. I also think the excuse he made after the Fury loss was a bit ridiculous. That the costume he'd worn had weighed him down. Come on, you're a professional athlete. That's just. I thought that was a stupid excuse. Um, but I do think this is a very interesting time for the heavyweights. Now that fight that fell through with Fury and Joshua, there's been a big backlash against Tyson Fury for that. I had a few questions about that. I certainly didn't get my hopes up because I thought something like that would happen. Why is it in Riyadh? Um, I mean, there's a lot of question marks around that. Firstly, the heat of a desert kingdom. I suppose with the night time, that's not so bad. But there has been an increasing number of fights in Saudi Arabia of late. Um, I think it was, let me get this right. I forget now. There was another high-profile fight. It was Joshua versus Ruiz in the heavyweight division, but there was another. I think it was one of the Smith brothers. I honestly can't recall off the top of my head, but that was in Saudi Arabia. So whether it's just that the kingdom's opening up more or what, I don't know. But there's some obvious questions. Can women attend? Because it's a country that segregates women from sporting events. So not just the fighters' girlfriends, but their family members. You know, that's a question mark. Um, and there's other things as well. So I think it's an unusual choice. But it would be interesting if they had something like, so we had the Rumble in the Jungle, the Thriller in Manila, Riyadh, uh, can't say the Rumble in Riyadh, it's been already used, but I don't know, you could add something to that. Showdown in Saudi, that might work. And then, of course, there's moral issues around the poly human rights abuses there, i.e., if you hold a big sporting event, does it kind of legitimize the regime? It's a difficult one. I mean, let's be honest, Fury and Joshua are going to be more focused on the business side of things, and maybe, maybe a real champion should be outspoken on something like that. I don't know. But then again, Ali and Foreman fought in what was then Zaire under the dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko, so there's a precedent. And boxers are sportsmen ultimately. They're not human rights activists. So I don't know. Um, but I do think we're in another golden era of heavyweight. So I think that, Fury will need to explain that, why that fell through, etc. I didn't get my hopes up. I thought something like that would happen. But these guys have to. One of the most frustrating things for fans is when there's a opportunity for a great fight and it just falls through. Um, because the fans feel deprived and it takes away something from boxing history when a fight that should have been never happens. And it would be a disgrace if Fury and Joshua never fight. And it's down to both men in the end of the day to push it. Because I do believe that, they might say there's business in the way, but in the end of the day, if they really want it, they'll make it happen. Because if they want it, I don't think the promoters and the managers could say no if they really, really want it. Another thing is because they're both British heavyweights, it would make sense to have it in Wembley. Um, I mean, that's another question mark on that one. It's a very rare occasion where you not only have, because for most of the 20th century, the history of British heavyweights was of nerdy men or guys who, frankly, were severely outmatched. And then came Lennox Lewis at the very end of the century. And since then, we've been doing a lot better. Now we have a situation where two of the world's heavyweight champions are both British, both from this island. That's something special, and we'll probably never see it again. A situation like that. That's why they have to fight. But in terms of eras, right? So we talk about the four kings of the 80s. I would argue that in the 2000s and the 2010s was sort of an era of four kings as well. And who are the guys I'm thinking of? Well, Floyd Mayweather, Manny Pacquiao, probably Juan Manuel Marquez, and Canelo Alvarez. Now, Canelo is a little bit different from the others because he's younger and he's a little bit distant from them. He fought Mayweather. He didn't fight any of the other guys. Nevertheless, Canelo was a great, great fighter, and I think he is dominating the sport today, much like Duran did in the 80s, or Leonard did in the 80s, or any of those guys did in the 80s. I do think Canelo has the potential to go down in the top 10 fighters of all time. It's always difficult to judge an active fighter because anything can happen, but Canelo is an outstanding fighter. Huge respect to Billy Joe Saunders. He gave his all in that fight, and that was a significant fight actually because I had a record apparently for an American indoor fight crowd, 73,000 people at the AT&T Stadium in, was it San Antonio, or I don't know if it was San Antonio. I need to double check that, but an American record. Now it's interesting. I think they just tend to have smaller stadiums than we do because the British record is something like 100,000. It isn't even Joshua versus Klitschko. It was a fight probably. There were several fights in the 1930s that you had 90,000 people, 100,000 in attendance. Harvey Mills was a big turnout. And fights that are now unfortunately forgotten, but they had in those days. Maybe because the tickets were cheaper. I don't know, but they had massive turnouts. Um, so the last fight that in the United States to get the number like that was Ali versus Spinks 2. So this is now a record. Billy Joe Saunders, Canelo Alvarez, and neither of them is even American. So that's interesting. But huge respect to Saunders for he showed grit, but Canelo's just too damn good. I'll go round this up soon. But thinking of you could give me any era, and I can name great fighters from that era, any decade of the 20th century. Um, so this idea that fighters today aren't blah blah, it's rubbish. It may be that there's frustrations in the sport, i.e., there's too many titles around. I agree with that. I do think that, but I don't think it's fair to blame the fighters for that. I think it's politics, boxing politics. The fact that you have four or five different sanctioning bodies. If there was a situation where something could happen where the WBA, the WBO, the IBF, and all these big bodies could come together. Get the fourth one off the top of my head. IBF, yeah. If they could all come together and somehow form a huge boxing federation, and then you have fewer titles, then it would be, maybe it would make people more satisfied. But right now in the world, there's something like 50 odd world champions, whereas in the past there would have been maybe 10 from the different weight divisions. But now you have subdivisions, and I do think that's one of the problems in the sport. So then there's an onus on fighters to unify the titles. It complicates matters, because then there's dispute over who really is the champion. Now, that's not an entirely new thing. There has been debates in the past over who was the lineal champion, who was the newspaper champion, because in the early 20th century, I've studied the history of the sport a lot, and in the early 20th century, you often had decisions made by newspapermen. It was pretty corrupt when you think about it. So if you look at any of the greats from the past, say Benny Leonard or Harry Greb or any of those guys, the records are pretty incomplete. The reason being is I'm talking about if you look at BoxRec and look at the record, you'll find different results. And the reason is quite often fights were not that well recorded. There would be a newspaper decision, i.e., you'd have pressmen at the side who would call it. It was quite scrappy the way it was done. It was not well organized compared to today. So, and you didn't have the technology today where you'd have like microsecond sort of performances, computer technology. So that's something that's improved in the sport. But honestly, it's the toughest of sports, and I just have enormous respect for fighters in general. Um, I may or may not like them as individuals, but I respect what they do. It takes guts to get into a ring, especially in front of a hostile crowd, and I always respect guys that are willing to go outside their comfort zone and face an opponent to when there's a hostile crowd, like Billy Joe Saunders with Canelo. Um, it takes guts to do that. I think sometime Canelo should fight outside Vegas or outside Mexico. If Canelo were to fight in the UK, he'd probably find that he'd have the crowd against him. I'm not sure if Canelo's ever been tested in that sense, with the exception of maybe the Mayweather fight. But even then, he was the crowd favourite. People want Mayweather to lose. So I'm not sure if Canelo's ever been outside his comfort zone in that sense. I think he's still a great fighter, but I do think every fighter needs to at least once sort of cross that line and fight outside their comfort zone where even if they have people traveling over, the majority of the crowd is against them. Why? Because there's another test for a fighter. Um, it's not, I don't like to see a fighter get booed, but it's another psychological dimension. I'm not sure Canelo's ever, fought in front of a hostile crowd, partly because he's a good-looking guy, or he has a lot of female followers. A little bit like, in that sense, he's a little bit like Oscar de la Hoya. He reminds me of that a bit. Um, But anyway, there's a lot of that's just boxing news at the moment. I haven't made a video like this for a while, so I'm just kind of amalgamating a lot of things. But I would say for the heavyweights, golden eras have been the 70s, maybe the 60s to an extent, but especially the 70s, the 90s. Yeah, I'd have to include the 90s as well, and the late 2010s onwards. Maybe the 20s will be a continuation of this, the 2020s. For the welters, I would say the 1980s and the 2000s, because of the guys I mentioned. Um, then the 50s, 40s and 50s was a good era for middleweights. You had guys like Sugar Ray Robinson and Jake LaMotta and others. Um, so, yeah, I'm just fascinated by the sport. I'm fascinated by the history of it. I'm fascinated by the politics can be frustrating, but yeah, let me know your thoughts, particularly regarding eras, right? I personally think we are in quite a good era at the moment, particularly for this country. We have a lot of great fighters out there. And huge respect to Josh Taylor. I don't tend to watch the lighter divisions that much, but apparently he was victorious and secured a victory in the lightweight division. He's now the lightweight champion of the world. Apologies, I'd need to look more into the details of that because I don't follow the lighter divisions that much. But that's, this country, Mexicans talk about their great fighters with every right, but we can be just as proud. We have produced some of the greatest fighters of all time, and we have a very long boxing heritage in this country. Um, okay, let me know your thoughts.